Okay, and one more.
Recording in progress.
And the floor is yours.
Okay, welcome everyone to the meeting of the Delta Independent Science Board. This is our virtual planning retreat. So it's day one of 2 days, and want to call the meeting to order and remind everyone to protect public health and safety due to COVID. We're having this meeting entirely virtually, which is very depressing because retreats you often kind of like to have person to person. But this will be our trial at a virtual retreat. We'll take written questions and comments, and please email your public comments and questions to the email on the screen, disb@deltacouncil.ca.gov. If you'd like to provide oral comments, you're welcome to do so using the raise hand function or sending us an email. And when identify what item you would like to talk about. And when it's time for public comments, we'll call on you and you can provide your full name and affiliation and probably a 3-minute public comment. I'd like to go through roll call, and when I call your name, state your full name and whether or not you have any new declarations to declare. Steve Brandt, no new declarations. Virginia?
Virginia Dale, no new declarations.
Joe?
No new declarations, Joe Fernando.
Tom?
Tom Holzer, no new declarations.
Tanya?
Tanya Heikela, no new declarations.
Okay.
I did want, can I make one quick announcement though?
Sure.
I just want to announce that Diane McKnight is one of the University of Colorado's newest distinguished professors. And I just want to make sure she got some applause for that today because it's a big honor.
Thank you very much. It's been quite a year for me, and I'm very proud to be associated with the University of Colorado.
Okay, Jay. Jay, you're on mute.
No new declarations.
Okay, Diane?
No new declarations.
Bob?
Bob Nyman, no new declarations.
And Lisa?
Lisa Wanger, no new declarations.
Okay, we'll move on to talk about the chair's report. And just a couple of items to report on. First, at our previous meeting, we received a public comment from Francis Coates dealing with data on recreational uses. And I believe Lisa followed up on that. Did you want to tell us what happened?
Yes, well, I think there's two issues. I think there's a more recent one that the group is looking into to see what was intended. And I'm just going to say that, you know, I've just started looking into this. I don't have any specific information about the exact case, but what it prompted me to do was look into what was known and what kind of data collection efforts are ongoing about recreational access. And so a couple things. First, I just want to share the concern that it is important for policymakers to fully understand the impacts to communities when they change things like access to fishing or access to any natural resources. And it's obviously important to engage with affected communities before, during, and after those decisions to prevent problems. So what I was looking into was, you know, how is recreational access understood and managed right now? And so I had some contact with Jessica Rudnick, who's a social scientist with California Sea Grant and the Delta Stewardship Council. And she was able to confirm that they are looking into better understanding how recreational access is provided to all sociodemographic groups. And I think in the near future, they're going to have a really nice database that's going to help them, you know, avoid these kinds of problems, most likely, or at least better manage them. And then there also is an environmental justice community survey that's been done by the California Department of Water, where they elicited responses from disadvantaged communities to understand their priorities and concerns regarding delta management. A lot of it had to do with access. And it really confirmed, that report really confirmed the importance of these fishing access issues. One of their conclusions was fishing is a way of life, that 90% of the sites that were identified by anglers they said they reported eating fish 4 or more times per week. So I just want the person who made the comment to know that we're not ignoring that comment. We're going to look into that, but probably in a more comprehensive way than in a case-by-case analysis.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Edmund asked me to report on the status of my blog on science integration and Jay and Mai's blog on non-native species. That's moving along real rapidly, and we're soon to get started. I wanted to, that's a joke, we're soon to get started. We will work on it. The Maven's Notebook has recently released a summary of our talk on the findings and recommendations on the non-native species review that we made at the Bay Delta Conference. Remind folks that we're looking for recruiting 2 Delta ISB postdoctoral scholars with California Sea Grant and the Delta Science Program. We released the job announcements on October 25th, and it's been circulated widely to a number of scientific societies, as well as on the Council on California Sea Grant and IEP listservs. It has a November 29th kind of deadline for at least first look at the applicants. I want to, the job flyer is part of your package material. We've only received 3 applicants so far, so I really want to encourage you folks to start beating the drums and recruit people to apply for this. Another item is that the council has, of course, moved forward to fill an open position we have on the Delta Independent Science Board, as well as 2 vacancies we expect towards the end of the year. So that announcement's gone out. Applications are due by November 30th, but will be accepted until February 1st. And there's a wide range of desired areas of expertise: water resources engineering, hydrodynamics, climate science, algae or invasive species ecology, ecotoxicology. And I really encourage you to talk to your colleagues and recommend that they apply for these positions. And again, these are 5-year positions, renewable for 5 years by the council. And I think it's, we really want to, from our perspective, want people who we can work with, who can help fill our disciplinary needs, but also those that can work in a wide variety of disciplines and with the folks with a wide variety of disciplines. And you now know what the job entails, and often we find people through our own colleagues and encouraging through our networks. So really encourage people to apply. If they have any questions, let them contact me, let them contact any other member of the board, and we can help to answer any questions you may have. We've also, the Delta program has also completed the search for a Sea Grant Fellow for 2022. That person is Allegra Lafer, who's a recent graduate from UC San Diego, where she received a master's degree in marine biodiversity and conservation. She reviewed, as part of her master's project, reviewed small-scale cooperative case studies and the benefits and services they provide their members. She's interested in long-term stakeholder engagement, looks forward to working with our board, and she will join the team sometime in early 2022. And usually about that time after she joins, we would ask her to give a small presentation on her area of interest. That's all the reporting I've got to do. I want to talk about our retreat a little bit. We have a 2-day retreat, and that will be our primary goal, is to try and set forward what our next reviews might be. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the first agenda item. We'll also be looking at getting an update on the water supply reliability review. We'll get that update tomorrow. And also an update on the marine, or not the marine, but the monitoring enterprise review, with a motion to do perhaps a content approval for that, take an action item on that for tomorrow. That'll be discussed tomorrow. Today we'll finish a brief meeting, and then we will break into small work groups, or briefing groups, I guess they're called. And then tomorrow we will have a 2-hour discussion on possible future ideas on where to go for reviews. So that's my report. Are there any public comments on this?
Or not.
Okay. I'd like to move into the next item, which is introduction to our planning retreat. And I'll give a brief presentation here. The board has had two other what we called retreats. One was in 2015, where we did a self-assessment and largely discussing how we do our business. We asked for, I think we did a survey, we had public comment periods, and we talked about how we do our reviews and where are there any ways we can improve those reviews. And I think at that stage, we adopted a number of things. We adopted it, I think, I could be wrong on exact timing, but we adopted our sort of 2-page flyer to help better communicate our results at the end of our reviews. We set up the prospectus as a way to provide sort of a more formal way of looking at how we do our reviews, what are the components of those reviews, and providing a short summary of what our intent is of the review in order to solicit public comments before we actually solicit the review. That was sort of a self-assessment purpose. That was in 2015. In 2017, we did more of a planning retreat where we began to look at what our next reviews might be. And in that stage, we also did a survey. We had an open public comment period. And from that, we came up with a number of different suggestions for reviews, which we followed up and did. That's where the reviews came for us to look at the IEP as a program, to look at that. We decided to do the water quality review at that stage. And I'm trying to think of the third one. Oh, the water supply reliability. Those were all decisions made during that retreat. We also decided to do an ecosystem level review and a restoration review. We never did, after various follow-up meetings, we sort of talked about restoration and ecosystem as one topic, and we had a number of ideas. One was fish and food webs as a component of ecosystems. Another was invasive species. Another was the spatial aspects of sort of the ecosystem connectivity between the delta and the bay and the ocean. And then linkages between the wetlands and terrestrial landscapes. And with further discussion and refinement, that narrowed it down to non-native species, and that's the review we did and completed. So we're at the stage now where we have largely completed, or will very soon complete, all of our existing reviews. Monitoring enterprise is in its final throes, as is water supply reliability, and we completed the non-native species. So we're at a stage where we can begin to look forward. And if I start off with the next slide. So our retreat goal is really two major steps. One is to flesh out some ideas in terms of how we prioritize and what criteria do we use to select reviews. And the second is brainstorm on potential review topics. I'm hopeful that we will walk out of tomorrow's discussion with some areas that we think might be worth pursuing. And what I mean by that is areas that we might want to flesh out further with maybe drafting a prospectus on it for consideration at the December meeting, and possibly areas we might want to pursue further in terms of having a seminar speakers or another workshop or a panel session and so forth. Now, we're not starting from scratch on new topics. But let me back up a little bit, and we've done a lot of work on looking at potential review topics already. We did a survey back in December of 2019, where we surveyed folks, what do you think is the next topics to review? We came up with the 2020 planning document that listed all the various review topics that came up during that survey and through further discussions. We've had, as part of this group, a science panel on HABs. We've had a science panel on food webs and pursued those areas fairly well. And we've also had now over the September, I believe September and October, August-September period, input from the major agencies doing work in the Delta and got their input on what they thought might be the primary topics. So we've had a lot of input already in terms of the kind of reviews, and now it's time for us to step forward and think about where do we go from here. So the next slide. Okay, just to put it in perspective now, what are our reviews supposed to be? And this is, I think, what our overall purpose of reviews are designed to do, to evaluate the state and adequacy of the science, recommend forward-looking strategic science priorities, identify gaps, increase scientific credibility, improve research clarity, advance the debate about Delta issues, and seek better connectivity between science, management, and policy. So any kind of review we do, this is sort of the background of what the intent of the review is supposed to be about in general. These are the thematic reviews. Next slide. And really what we want to talk about is when we come up with an idea, why do we want to do this review? How would we do it? What things do we need to consider in each review? And, really what is the science topic that we're reviewing? In the next slide. Now, the prospectus, this is what is our plan for a review. When we come up with an idea, we write a prospectus, and it has these components to it. And I'm hopeful by the end of tomorrow, we'll have some ideas, maybe even some answers to these questions for a particular topic, but ideas that we can then go forward to and ask these questions about to really solidify what we're talking about in terms of a review. This content is actually in our own board guidelines. So this is the kind of way we outline each perspective. Motivation for the review, why are we doing it? Who's the intended audience? What sort of inputs do we need to get to do the review? What's the time frame? What other reviews pertinent to this subject have been done, and what are expected products and outcomes? And these have all been quite variable. The way we've done reviews, I think, has been quite variable. One review, I think on levies, we did it with just a workshop. It was very short. It was one workshop, and the review was written. Other ones, like the monitoring, has done everything from contracting on the other extreme to contracting to surveys to interviews, very long process with data analysis and inventory and so forth. That's the other side of the extreme of the review. Some have had interviews and surveys, others have not. Some have done more literature reviews than others. And I think that flexibility is something the board has always talked about, is that we pick the topic and then ask the question, what is the best way to gain the information we need in order to do the review? But when we're discussing this and brainstorming, maybe it's worthwhile to keep this in the back of your mind. And so when you think about a topic, one could ask these questions, who's the audience for, and what's our products, and how we might go about doing it. The next slide. In the last retreat, there was a lot of other ideas that kind of came up. And those are things like climate change. I'll pick in particular forecasting capabilities, and sort of the science and social system linkages and uncertainty. Those are things that people thought we ought to review, but after further discussion, we thought, well, these are things that really should be part of every review. When we talk about invasive species, when we talk about monitoring programs, just about water supply, we ought to really consider climate change impacts as part of that review process. And that it's not required we do that, but we've suggested that each of these topics ought to be considered in the review and decide whether or not it's of value to explore them in that particular review. That doesn't say we couldn't do a special review on any one of these topics. More recently, it's been suggested by members of this board that maybe the use of adaptive management ought to be also a component in the reviews. We've done that in some of those invasive species. We took that as our framework. We're doing it in the monitoring review right now in terms of putting together an adaptive management framework for the science that's related to that particular topic. Okay, the next slide. These are some of the ideas that have come up in both in our surveys, our discussions, and our own planning documents. The harmful algal blooms, of course, and food webs we've already had panels on. Environmental flows is really something that is part of a core strategy in the Delta Plan, the ecosystem chapter, looking at creating more natural Delta flows. Large-scale modeling and long-term forecasting or integrated modeling. Restoration was one that came up at our last retreat, and it continues to come up. Water quality 2 was suggested by Water Quality 1, and when they only did certain components of the water quality. Subsistence reversal has come up, climate change, and also the more generic topic of emerging issues. In the next slide, jumping to prioritization criteria, these are ideas that you all came up with in various discussions we've had. One is talking about the merit or impact. Would the topic scope apply to more than one agency? Do we know which of those agencies would be interested in this? Now we have some more sense of that with our last August and September discussions with lead agency heads. Do we know who will benefit from this review or how they will benefit? Would the review contribute to upcoming decisions? And based on what we know as a topic, something that is being neglected or understudied. The feasibility, what's the expected length of time to complete the review? Can the scope be defined such that the review would be completed within 1 or 2 years? That's been suggested. It certainly didn't apply to the monitoring as a criteria. Monitoring, by the way, is a topic that had come up ever since the day I first started in the board as a continual suggestion. We need to review monitoring programs. But that's something we can consider as a criteria. And then finally, do we have the expertise to take on the review? And I think the last slide, just again, the breakout sessions are going to have, look at the criteria. Is there something else you think should be included as a criteria? Then what major topics should we consider? And are we ready in a position to put some of those topics forward for full board discussion and consideration of maybe putting together a writing team or something to begin the draft, a draft prospectus so we can answer some of the basic framing questions for that review. My hope is that we'll have some of those ideas so that maybe at the December meeting we can move enough forward to select a topic or two, or however many we decide we want to do by December. The next slide. So today we're going to get a presentation from the Lauren Hastings report, and that will help us, again, not necessarily about review topics, but maybe perhaps review criteria, and also discussing the components of the input we need before and input we need after the review. And then we'll adjourn, and we will have those briefing sessions this afternoon. And tomorrow we reconvene at 9:30, and we'll decide whether we're ready to begin prioritization or selection of the review topics, or if there's any other steps that we want to take before we select topics. So I think that's my presentation. Open for board discussion on any of that. Any thoughts? We're going to have 2 hours tomorrow to discuss the results of your small group meetings.
Yeah, I, for one, will hold my comments until we can discuss them, but not very nice summary, Steve.
Okay, any questions or comments from board members?
Hey, Steve, this is Joe. Sorry. The topics you just listed came up from the last retreat?
The topics came up from a variety of sources. The last retreat, we talked about water quality. We talked about climate change, and then we put climate change in the as part of the this is to consider for everything. The just running through these restoration, yes, it did come up from the last retreat, but it's also come up more recently. I'm trying to look for the. We also put together a.
Yeah, and also just the reason is that Jay and I put forward a topic which was the modeling, hydrodynamic modeling and water quality modeling. That basically I didn't see, so I was wondering whether it was discussed or.
Nothing's been discussed or eliminated. These were things that.
Yeah, so we will put forward that during the discussion today again, right? Okay.
Yeah. We also had the planning document, if you recall, and I think some of these things came from the planning document. Edmund, the 2020 planning document. I see Edmund's wants to talk.
Oh yeah, Joe, just to clarify, the modeling with water quality, that's part of water quality too, the descriptions.
Okay. Yeah, and I would suggest I think you all have the all of the documents I mentioned, but particularly the planning document 2020, where some of these bullets are more fleshed out and explained. Climate, I think when we did our last survey in December of 2019, climate came up in one way or another in almost all of the comments, some form of dealing with climate change.
Steve, do you know what the status of the science needs assessment that we were doing for or with NEPAC?
It went on hiatus over the last few months, mainly because Jay and I were sort of doing stuff, and then it just sort of quieted down. Maybe Jay can correct me, and we're now going to reinvigorate that and move forward. And I think we want to. We're putting together a couple of pages. I think one on ecosystem forecasting. I know I was supposed to put that together. Jay, what else were we?
Well, I think this is, now that we have the board, back up to speed a little bit, moving up to speed, and that the science needs assessment is really a very strategic kind of an effort. I guess I would encourage the board members to think about their level of interest in becoming involved in this topic, considering it almost like another review, but probably on a shorter time frame. At a little different audience. I'm a little bit concerned that I'm only on the board until October, and so I won't be in any position to see anything through on this. And so I think it's probably important to have some new board members, if they're interested, at least shadow on this and show some interest if there is interest in it. I think it's a rare opportunity for us to have a bigger role in scientific thinking for the Delta.
Yeah, that's why I raised the question, because we usually don't interact with management so much in reviews, and here's an opportunity to do that.
Right. And I think basically it's important that there be people that are longer on the board than October to see this thing through.
Right.
Yeah, to remind folks what we had done as a board is a while back, we sent a letter to DPIC, which is, you should all know what DPIC is, which is something we rarely do, and suggested that with the rapid changes that are going on in the world, climate change and so forth being one of those, that science needs to have some major changes happening to it. And they actually adopted, they were also looking at the funding of science at the time, so they adopted that and gave a sanction to move forward on it. So we joined both the council members and a variety of other folks, agency folks, to look at science needs assessment. Over the course of a year, we ran a number of, it was going to be a face-to-face workshop, but we ended up running a number of workshops looking at what are the science needs in the context of rapid change. I think we had 4 topics. I don't remember them all offhand. And what are the key scientific needs? We ended up writing a couple of documents that went through, came back to the board at various locations in the process. And we were ready to go back to make a presentation back to DPEC, and then things sort of slowed down towards the end of last year, or whenever they slowed down. I don't remember.
Yeah, but between COVID and and the attempted dissolution of the board, effectively, this really is a year or 2 behind where we had hoped it would be. And I'm a little bit concerned that we need to really make sure that when we do this, we're not, the people that do this are not out ahead of where the board wants to be on this. And I'm not sure the board knows where it wants to be on this.
Yeah, I think reinvigorating that group, and maybe if others want to join, it would be worthwhile. I know Tom, Jay, and I were the 3 involved at the stage, but certainly others can be.
It might be a longer process than we were hoping for.
But it is a great opportunity to interact with management in a way that we normally don't. So.
Something to think about.
Oh, Laurel, did you have something to say?
I didn't. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, I didn't.
Okay. I just saw your light go on. All right.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was unmuted. You probably heard my mouse clicking.
Okay. Any public comments on this?
We do. There was actually some difficulties with the raise hand function earlier. So Deirdre Desjardins has public comments for agenda item 2 and 3. So your chair's report and this item. So Deirdre, I've given you permission to unmute your microphone. Please state your name and affiliation. And for our screen share, can we push the public comments to 6 minutes? Thank you.
So it's Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. And I just wanted to read you, the COP26 was last week and the week before. And there was a big California delegation that went there. The Secretary of Natural Resources was there, the Lieutenant Governor, the Cal EPA Secretary, one of every 8 legislators was there. The Governor's Office of Governor, Senior Climate Advisor, Lauren Sanchez was there. So this is what Wade Crowfoot said. Climate change has gotten existential for us. We have wildfires that have burned 1 of every 15 acres in the state. It's burned entire communities. Jared's agency, that's Cal EPA, is providing emergency water to people. We have communities across the state that are experiencing record temperatures. I try to keep it very real. The time for talking is complete. It's time for taking action. We're showing that we can decouple economic growth and prosperity from carbon pollution. People take notice. They understand we can do it. There's a lot of work that can get done. Jared Blumenfeld said there's a lot of interest in California's investment for climate adaptation. $15 billion is larger than the budgets of many countries. There's a lot of interest in California's work on low carbon fuel standard and air pollution. The thing I took away was the sense of urgency. Often it was legislative leaders or leaders in California that were pushing. So another person at Wade Stable said it's really great to see the focus on adaptation. It used to feel like adaptation was the ugly stepsister, or it was something not considered. Now it's important that everyone across the board is aware of. Adaptation is really important. The focus is on nature-based solutions, helping to heal nature, help to heal us and to heal our planet. I'm happy to take those international goals down to a local level. The other thing, I did ask Crowfoot at the briefing, are there any discussions about water? Said absolutely. Now they're including both climate resilience and climate mitigation. California is not alone in being challenged on water. There's weather whiplash, drought, and too much water. All of the countries in Mediterranean climates are having similar challenges. He said they're kind of like speed dating for ideas. Some of you in California know that we have signed various MOUs with various countries. There's more discussion around that. They also signed a new pledge on biodiversity with a coalition of subnational governments. So I just wanted to give you this high-level discussion on climate change and climate adaptation, because I think some of the adaptive management in the Delta is really now climate adaptation. So I also sent you my notes from their briefing. Thank you. Oh, and I'll just send you some notes about, there's 2 administrative matters. One is I did get budget numbers for the board for this year, which I will crunch. I just didn't have a chance because of COP26. Thank you. But I'll do that at some point.
Okay, thanks very much, Deirdre. Very, very informative. It's good to hear about COP. Any other public comments?
There are none.
Okay, let's move on to agenda item number 4, which is a presentation on the Delta Science Program's draft assessment of the Delta ISB. Now recall that Lauren Hastings led an effort with Chelsea Batavia and Edmund Yu with the science program to do sort of an assessment of the Delta ISB, really to document and better understand our impacts and significance to the Delta. We've already received one presentation on this. You should have all seen a draft of the document itself, and which is out for public comment, I believe, until December 1st. We as a board had kind of decided we wouldn't do a public comment at this stage, but what we would do is after the report is finalized and after we decide how or if we're going to modify our overall operational procedures and so forth, then we could respond formally and to the report and say this is things that we've decided to do and this is things we've decided not to do or whatever, but that would be done somewhat after this process, the public comment process is over. And so today we'll get a presentation from Lauren on this, and then we'll have some time for question and answer. So floor is yours, Lauren.
Great, thanks, Steve. I'm very pleased to be reporting on our draft Delta Independent Science Board assessment today. And I am the one presenting the report, but I'm by no means solely responsible for its development. So I really want to acknowledge my co-authors, Chelsea Batavia and Edmund Yu, for their tremendous contributions. Chelsea has taught us the methods that social scientists use to develop surveys and questionnaires and then how to analyze that data. And Edmund has brought his years from working with the Delta Independent Science Board, his knowledge about what they've done and how they've done it, how all of you have done it, those who've been around. And he spent hours finding and verifying how ISB products have been used, including talking with staff, querying citation databases, and reviewing documents. In addition, both Edmund and Chelsea contributed much of the actual writing of the report. So it was my great honor and privilege to work with this team. Now onto the report. Next slide. So why did we do this assessment? Next slide. Well, the timing was right. We started the review in 2020. The ISB had been in place for 10 years after it was established by the 2009 Delta Reform Act, which charged it with providing oversight of the scientific research, monitoring and assessment programs that support adaptive management of the Delta. In 2020, there were 5 of the original 10 members cycling off the board. They had served the maximum number of 2 terms, 5 years each. And an additional member had chosen not to seek a second term. So that left 6 vacancies, which meant there was primarily a mostly new board, all of you today. And it just seemed like really good timing to do an evaluation to inform your planning processes. Next slide. So what has the board produced in its first 10 years? Well, you all have completed over 50 products primarily in these 3 categories: programmatic thematic reviews, which are those designed to meet the legislative mandate to review programs by themes or topical areas; agency document reviews, which are reviews of specific documents, plans, or papers that are requested by the authors or by other interested parties; and finally, call to action letters or memos that are generated by the Independent Science Board to share the board's insights, findings, or recommendations that might require action. Next slide. The objectives of our assessment were to document uses of board products completed between 2010 and 2020, and then to find out what the perceptions are of the impact or influence of those products and the value or significance of both the Delta ISB and its products. We are reporting our findings to all of you today, and we have our report out for public review with the purpose of informing improvements to board processes with the intent of increasing the value and impacts of future board products. Next slide. The approach we took was we collected and analyzed 3 types of information. We developed an inventory of ISB products and verified uses. We also assessed stakeholder perceptions of the ISB and its products through interviews with 26 stakeholders and a survey that received 174 responses. We also interviewed 11 past and ongoing ISB members for their observations and advice. Next slide. So what did we learn? Next slide. Our overarching findings include: we learned that the Delta Independent Science Board is recognized as an important source of independent scientific oversight and review in the Delta. Stakeholders see the ISB as objective, apolitical, and a scientific resource. They emphasize the value of having a standing independent science board. And as you can see from these survey results, the majority agree that the ISB is essential, performs relevant reviews that are rigorous, and provides good recommendations. Next slide. After 10 years, the Delta ISB has an established yet evolving process for conducting reviews within the scope of its legislative mandate. Most board members we interviewed felt that the processes developed by the board over the last 10 years, shown in the graphic here, work well and have improved over time. The steps include, as Steve just went over, but I'll just briefly go through them again: identifying and selecting thematic topics, developing a prospectus that is publicly reviewed, gathering the information through surveys, interviews, panels, and literature reviews and other means, and conducting the review, then developing draft reports and discussing them publicly. When the report is considered close to finalizing, the report is released for public review. It's then finalized and presented to the Delta Stewardship Council. And finally, outreach is done on that report. So while these steps have been determined to work well, board members that we interviewed also recognized that there's still room for improvement in almost all of them and had some specific suggestions. Next slide. Our next finding is that Delta Independent Science Board products are used in a variety of ways, but most often in policy and management applications. We found that the greatest number of citations were of the Independent Science Board reviews of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan and Water Fix, which were cited in comment letters and covered action appeals. ISB reviews also were used for program support, scientific citations, informational purposes, incorporating feedback into agency documents, and implementation of recommendations in thematic reviews. Next slide. We found that implementation of Delta Independent Science Board recommendations is nuanced and not always direct. We did find evidence of direct implementation, including the Delta Science Plan, which was developed in response to an ISB recommendation for a science plan that addresses regional challenges and spans agency boundaries. And other examples include incorporation of feedback from document reviews. However, we learned from stakeholder interviews that frequently implementation is indirect, meaning that recommendations provide momentum or leverage for current or planned activities often already envisioned. An example of this are the recent discussions about improving science governance. Next slide. A range of outcomes and influences beyond implementation of recommendations is associated with the Delta Independent Science Board and its products. We found that board members and stakeholders feel that ISB products provide scientific contributions, often through identifying uncertainties and knowledge gaps. In addition, ISB recommendations may catalyze community responses, such as workshops or planning processes. An example here is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service told us that ISB recommendations in Fish and Flows and other reviews helped them to realize that they needed to hire more modelers. ISB recommendations may provide stakeholder support through identifying priorities that align with those of stakeholder groups, thus lending credibility to their actions. Stakeholders also discussed how the Independent Science Board can direct attention to important issues that others may miss. An example of this is the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee letter that you discussed earlier on rapid environmental change. Next slide. Many stakeholders felt increased engagement would improve Delta ISB reviews and increase the likelihood that recommendations will be implemented. We'll go into more detail on this finding in the next section. Next slide. Considerations for the Delta Independent Science Board. Next slide. First, we wanted you to know that stakeholders conveyed largely positive attitudes about the board and expressed affirmations for its products and other contributions to the Delta. Even though our report contains constructive criticisms and suggestions for improvement, we heard a lot of support and appreciation for what the board does and what it has done over the last 10 years. Now on to some stakeholder suggestions. Next slide. Some stakeholders felt that the board has erred on the side of maintaining too much independence and urged the Delta ISB to better familiarize itself with the realities of Delta science and management. While no one questioned the importance of the board's independence, some suggested that the board could increase connections without compromising its independence. They suggested the board could provide more helpful and actionable recommendations by becoming more familiar with the on-the-ground issues and regulatory requirements. Next slide. Some felt the board could seek more input from the stakeholder community when selecting topics for review. Some suggested more interaction with Delta scientists, managers, and decision makers to learn what would be most helpful to them. They thought it was important to learn how the management and regulatory systems work, to have in-Delta meetings and site visits, and to learn and understand the state of Delta science. This point is especially relevant for your afternoon discussions. Next slide. In addition, some stakeholders encourage engagement with target implementers as recommendations are formulated. Several interview groups urged the board to work more closely with potential implementers to develop recommendations that are more practical, actionable, and relevant. One person called these reality check-ins, so that the ISB is aware of the responsible party's activities, interests, and constraints. Not all stakeholder interviewees shared this view, however. One group felt the board should not promote its recommendations because decisions around implementation reflect values, which shouldn't be decided by scientists. Although this was a minority view, this idea prompts some interesting questions about the role of independent science and values, which we explore in box 1 of chapter 3 in our report. We encourage you to take a look at that box as you proceed in discussions on future planning. Next slide. In our survey, we found that outreach and communication were widely identified as areas for improvement. Stakeholders listed several positive aspects of ISB outreach, including the public meetings and responsiveness to comments. But they also highlighted areas for improvement, including targeted outreach and perhaps developing an overall communication strategy. Nearly all interviewed ISB members recommended more direct interaction with agency and stakeholder representatives on report findings. They suggested council and Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meetings are good places to connect with decision makers, but also recommended identifying other relevant venues for outreach. So now I'll briefly mention our assessments considerations for the Delta Stewardship Council and staff. Next slide. Interviews with both stakeholders and Delta ISB members revealed encouragement for greater and more deliberate interaction between the Delta ISB and the council. Board members emphasize that council and Delta Science program support is critical for helping the board with outreach and communication. However, they mentioned they would like more input on what the council is doing to implement ISB recommendations and would like to hear more about overall implementation status. Stakeholders mentioned that board activities should more regularly be reported at council and DPIC meetings. Next slide. Several board members felt the council should go beyond improving communication to raise awareness of Delta ISB reviews and more actively promote implementation of ISB recommendations. Some noted that the council has the resources to promote ISB products and could encourage others, including legislators, to look at them. One felt the council has the weight and authority to push forward ISB reviews where the ISB itself does not. Next slide. Tracking implementation of Delta ISB recommendations was identified as a gap that should be filled. Board members felt they were mostly unaware of implementation status of their recommendations because there was no process in place for tracking prior to our assessment. However, they felt that detailed tracking was not their purview and should be done by council or Delta Science program staff. However, I will point out that when the ISB first started doing thematic reviews, their original idea was to review each theme again, which would provide an opportunity to learn about what recommendations had been implemented and also to provide new insights. Next slide. So that's the conclusion of our brief overview of our findings for consideration. The draft report is currently out for public comment through December 1st. After that, we'll incorporate feedback and finalize our report. So now we welcome your discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lauren. Any board members want to start the discussion? Tom?
Yeah, I have a couple questions, Lauren. With regard to the communicating better with the council, you know, when I look at the technical sophistication of some of our reviews, the council is not really the audience for it. It's really technical people who are able to digest that stuff. And I'm wondering if you got any suggestions on how to actually do that communication, because the review itself might be overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. I also want to mention that both Edmund and Chelsea will participate in responding to questions. So I'll ask them to chime in as appropriate. For that question, I think a lot of it depends on the audience for your reviews, I believe. And again, Chelsea, chime in if I get this wrong, but I think a lot of the stakeholders felt that your reviews actually have different audiences. They talked about the levels, and this is in our report, kind of the scientists, the managers, and then the policymakers. And if you look at your reviews, I think some are very science oriented, but some are actually more under the purview of the policymakers themselves, the director level, things where it really encompasses changing regulations, providing funding. Those are decisions that the on-the-ground scientists can't make. It's got to come from someone higher up. And so you may not realize it, but I think your audience is actually at that higher level. I think to answer your question, I think this is an area where you probably need some support in how to communicate to those various audiences, because it is different to communicate to policymakers than scientists. And you need to maybe different communication products and venues and ways of transmitting that message.
Can I follow up with a simple question on that topic? What motivation does an individual agency have, if any, to follow our recommendations?
You know, I think that's a great question. Your recommendations are not mandated. I mean, implementing your recommendations are not mandated. And so I think that's a good question. I think they are motivated in the ways in which they find them helpful. And so that's what we learned really from our stakeholders, that might be something you may want to study a little bit more. We actually learned what are the ways in which they find them helpful. What are the ways in which they have found them not helpful? You know, so one of the things we heard is that all of you as a standing body of top-notch, nationally and internationally recognized scientists, established in statute, that you have a lot of stature. So people know who you are, they recognize that stature and that they should pay attention to what you're saying. And so I think that is some motivation, but in other ways, they found that it was challenging to implement the recommendations, even though they thought in general that it was a great idea, but we're not able to do that for various reasons. So yeah, and Chelsea, and if you want to chime in on this, that would be helpful.
No, I think you've really captured it well. What I heard from the stakeholders was that there is a lot of, I guess I would characterize it almost as intrinsic motivation to try to follow recommendations. We heard in numerous interviews and on the survey that people just think that the recommendations are good, even if they don't feel that they have any ability to implement them. They think that they are good things to be happening in the Delta. And so that, I think, provides some sort of motivation. It's really just the logistical challenges that are coming in as barriers.
Tom, did you have another question?
Yeah, it's a lot simpler. Steve, you may have the answer to it. My impression was that in order to communicate better, when Randy was the chair of the council, we started putting our recommendations up front in the report. Is that correct?
That came from Brian. Well, if I don't know if I can chime in, but I know
Oh,
Brian
okay.
Atwater, previous board member, at least when I was around, often recommended that get the recommendations right up front to capture the reader's interest.
Because that seemed to me to help Randy a lot in our reports, because it got the critical message management message out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think all of us have this challenge of how to reach policymakers, knowing that they are very, very busy. They have many things under their purview, and they will not take a lot of time to read a 100-page report or maybe even a 20-page report. So you have to, there are different ways to interact with them and meet them. I mean, you have the benefit, I think the ISB has the benefit of the opportunity of direct interaction with the Delta Stewardship Council chair and executive officer, who are typically on, I think, most of your ISB meetings. And it's much easier, I think, for you to address the council, perhaps to get on their agenda, even on DPIC, since the Delta Stewardship Council supports DPIC. But probably more challenging are going to be to reach those other policymaker audiences. This is an area where you could use some help in figuring out how to do that, I think.
Well, let me ask a question, and because I think I saw it in your report. You know, one of the things that that we're going to do for your report is to provide a formal comment about how we responded to it. Part of our charge, and formally, is to present our review results directly to the council. That's the only thing that is legally required for us to do. So we do present it to the council, but I don't know that we've ever gotten a formal response of how those recommendations were implemented. And is that something, your suggestion, that we should ask the council for a formal response? Of course, the council chair is also the DPIC chair, but that the council should respond formally to us on how they intend to implement our results in a policy manner?
Well, one of the things I want to point out is that we were pretty careful when we wrote this report to just present what we found and then present that to you for your consideration, but without making our own recommendations. But what you just said, Steve, was a recommendation that we heard from interviews of the current and past ISB members that we interviewed. Was exactly, not necessarily exactly what you said, but they realized that they had not received as much direct reporting from the Delta Stewardship Council as they wish they would have had on how the council itself has implemented recommendations. So it's really up to you to consider what you want to ask for. One of the recommendations was it might be helpful, or one of the thoughts from those we interviewed was it might be helpful to have some discussions of perhaps the council chairship and ISB chairship and council executive level folks, just to talk about that and see what could be done.
Is there any way, and this is, I know the Delta Science Program has some money, and I know at some stage there was talking about, and they fund science, and I know at some stage they were talking about getting more money. Would it be reasonable to suggest that the science program should prioritize their science funding towards our recommendations?
I think it's up to you to figure out how you want to proceed.
I knew you were going to dodge that.
Read our report and discuss it among yourselves, I think.
Bob and then Joe.
So Lauren, I thought the observations that were made in the report were really excellent. I thought there was a lot of substance to them. And in thinking about them, I thought this was you've presented us with a great opportunity to discuss them internally and then come back with a strategy on how we might address your observations and make things better. I think what you've done is a tremendous first step forward And I think the ball is going to be very soon, I think, in our court to really think about a strategy so that we can be more effective as we go into the future. So I just wanted to say that because I really enjoyed reading those, and I thought they were very observant of what's going on within the Delta. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
Joe?
Yeah, so the previous discussion, I think I read it correctly that some of the interviewees thought that the Delta Stewardship Council should take a proactive role in promoting our recommendations, because that should be a very good conduit for the policymakers, because that's a kind of direct connection. So maybe one thing we might want to do is to have that discussion, which we just discussed, with the Stewardship Council and ask how they can promote the recommendations, implementation to the policymakers. The second question I had was, Lauren, is that they said that there was too much independence of the science board. What did they mean by too much independence? Because if I remember correctly, we always have a public discourse before we do anything, quite careful to do that public outreach. So there must be some things which we are lacking. Probably they are thinking that we have too much independence. Do you have any kind of insight on that?
Sure. Do you want to take that, Chelsea?
I can chime in there. Yeah. So this was it was interesting. It was a recurring theme that we heard throughout interviews, and people, I wouldn't characterize it as too much independence. I would say that people were often thinking about this tension, if you will, between the independence of the board and their familiarity and connection with people in the Delta and the Delta science and management scene. And so they set up this kind of like balancing act that the board has to maintain. And I think that what we heard was that some people felt like you're leaning a little bit too heavily toward independence at the expense of being, you know, engaged with and fully apprised of and connected with the Delta stakeholder scene. So they felt that it was really important for you to maintain your independence, but that you could become more familiar with the Delta and its stakeholders without compromising that. And so I think what we were hearing, and we heard similar commentaries in the interviews with the current and former Delta ISB members, that they also wrestled with this tension at times. For example, being aware that often in reviews, you're collecting information from the people who are part of programs that are being reviewed, and that creates a little bit of a tension. And as you become more engaged, as you build relationships, it can become more difficult to retain independence, objectivity, to remain free of bias. So I think that those are all considerations that the board should keep in mind, and that was the advice that we heard from people we talked to. But considering, are there ways to become more familiar with what is happening in the Delta, and specifically the realities that people who are working in the management and the regular context, the constraints, the realities, the logistics of the world that they're living in? Are there ways for the board to really immerse itself more in an understanding of what that looks like, but then also, you know, staying outside of the kind of, you know, management and political fray that characterizes some of what happens in the Delta, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Yes, yes, certainly. So that means it's not the independence, it's the cognizance of the Delta needs. We have to have much more cognizance and respect when we do things. Yeah, okay, thanks.
So Chelsea, as a follow-up, when you were talking about stakeholders, I certainly understand the argument with respect to agencies, that there's the tension between being too familiar with the agencies that we're reviewing so that we narrow down the scope of our recommendations to those things that they want to hear. But in terms of stakeholders, were you also referring to the broader stakeholders, to the public, to the things like that, that there's a need there as well?
We did hear that from at least one interview group. We heard that there was strong encouragement for the board to become more engaged with broader Delta communities, people who are living in the Delta, residents, people who are working, recreating in the Delta. I would say on the whole, the feedback that we received was more focused on the agency and management context than it was on Delta communities. Lauren, I'll let you chime in if you have different recollections than I do. But that was certainly something that we heard from one group in particular, and pointing out that folks who do, Delta communities and residents, they have needs for science as well, but that would require a different type of product and synthesis of perhaps, unique types of information that the board hasn't really addressed in the past, or packaging it in different ways. So that's something else for you to consider in your discussions, I would say.
And are there thoughts about how one would do that?
We heard, well, the encouragement was to get out in the Delta and interact with people to hear how they see the world and what their needs and concerns are. And then to allow those expressed needs and concerns to drive the scope of the review and the products that you produce. Again, I don't want to overstate, this was really focused from commentary in one interview group that we had. So I just want to keep that in perspective.
I would add, though, that the perspective of getting, and I know we've had the issues with the pandemic, obviously, but the opportunity to get out into the Delta and see it and talk directly to all of the stakeholders, the folks that live and recreate in the Delta, along with representatives of the agencies and different stakeholder groups, is really important. That came through by many of the stakeholder interviewees.
Okay, Lisa.
Just a simple follow-up on that conversation. So thanks for that perspective. As a social scientist, of course, I don't disagree at all with the need to talk to people and find out what their needs are. But I'm wondering how well this prospectus is working. So, we do this in a baby step kind of way now, where we say, here's the review we're thinking of, and we put this out. Was there any particular comments about whether that step was working to get feedback?
Chelsea, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure if it may be that I don't know if we had a question that was focused directly on the prospectus, but I don't recall specific comments on that from stakeholders, but go ahead.
From stakeholders, we did not receive certainly a lot of commentary on this prospectus. We did hear from one group, there was just appreciation for the opportunity to provide public comment, to provide input at that and other stages of the review. But that is the only specific instance that I can recall where the prospectus specifically came up.
Maybe I can add to the kind of the broader discussion. And again, Chelsea, please chime in. But it seemed to me that it came across, it was interesting. For the folks that we interviewed, we did actually deliberately interview people that we felt more aware of the Delta ISB and its efforts and products. But even among them, they seemed unaware of many of the details of your process and outreach efforts, including on all ends of the steps of the process, identifying topics, knowing that a prospectus was out for review even. So, there are still people out there among your audience members who are interested in what you're doing and want to pay attention, but are still not able to track. And one of the things we heard is it takes time and effort. They have so many things going on that they can't, and they get so many email messages, they can't necessarily find the time to track every single thing that you're doing. So your efforts are competing with all of the other activities they're doing for their attention. So they may miss the opportunity to weigh in the appropriate step on and provide their input, even though it seemed to me that after the fact, when a review came out, and maybe then they did finally pay more attention, it seemed that they had questions then. Why was this topic selected? Why was it done in this way? Why wasn't I reached out to or something? So so that's just a challenge, I think, for everyone who's doing work in the Delta.
Tom?
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. And what you just made about the stakeholders coming in at the end, that was certainly our experience with the water supply reliability study. I mean, even though we had public meetings let's see, and of course a prospectus, we really didn't have the attention of the stakeholders until we wrote the report. And boy, did they come out in force. And it would have been much better to get those messages when we had started. So that I think what it's telling us is maybe prospectus isn't the way to characterize this communication. It should be a request for stakeholder input or something like that at the beginning that clearly spells out what we're intending to review, and I ask for their input early in the thing. But I think it's a serious issue.
Well, I think we're also hearing just from a behavioral economics viewpoint, we just need to make it easier for them, you know, dedicated times when we're listening or something like that. Sounds to me.
You know, we have given presentations routinely at the Bay Delta Conference as well as at the IEP workshop. And sometimes those were presentations basically on a prospectus saying, here's what our intent is, and here's where we are, what we're doing. And we usually get quite a bit of feedback, particularly at those conferences, and maybe more enhanced thinking about hitting the right groups of people at the very early stage of one of these things and let them know what's going on. And conferences is one way to do it, or some community outreach event or something. Virginia.
My experience is it takes a lot of effort to engage the stakeholders and engage the proper stakeholders. You have to identify who they are. You have to have mechanisms to reach out to them. You have to speak their language. You have to understand where they're coming from. You know, you have to go to them or pay for them to come to you. It's usually better to go to them. You know, those are some of the things that are really important. And as I've mentioned before, this group of Idaho is working on in an engage process. It's funded by NSF.
So, Lauren, has there been a similar sort of review of the council or something like that?
Well, the Delta plan underwent a 5-year review a few years ago, which was somewhat similar. And in fact, I took a look at that review when we were trying to design this assessment to see how that was approached. And they did have a stakeholder assessment component to that, along with a staff-driven assessment of the Delta plan. It was of the Delta plan, not necessarily the council and the Delta plan, but they did get feedback on the council itself. So if you want to take a look at that, it's publicly available on our website.
I'm just more thinking about the public connection to the council. They seem to have a fairly large attendance at their meetings. Of course, they're dealing with more policy and decision-making issues. But if, I think you suggested earlier, is maybe more routine presentations of our stuff there would also give it some exposure to people who might be.
Well, and that's one of the things we found in the interviews is that some of the folks we interviewed may not tune in regularly to ISB meetings, but at least it came across to me that they did fairly regularly tune into Delta Stewardship Council meetings, which is, I think, like you just said, where that recommendation came from.
Any other questions?
So just a quick question. now they say that our outreach, 62%, I think, right, disagreed that we do the outreach well. That basically is not a very good number. Can you make a comment on that? How, what were they thinking and how we can improve?
Well, I think we've actually been talking about that quite a bit just now, you know, and it is challenging. But I think the thoughts that came through the interviews that we got were it takes work and you're doing it now, but you know, early on when the ISB first came about, I think you finished a review, was presented to the council and discussed at a council meeting, it was posted on our website, and that was about it. So all of you are doing much more now, and especially the targeted outreach, you know, example you presented at the camped meeting recently, the outcomes of your monitoring enterprise review. So that's the kind of thing that was recommended, more targeted outreach, more deliberate identification up front of the target audiences, and then identifying up front who are the potential implementors and how can we reach them at various stages of the review, not necessarily just at the end. So and this is something that probably the support staff can help you with, you know, because support staff are much more familiar with those various groups, because there are a lot of collaborative groups and that meet pretty regularly, and a lot of different listservs. You know, I mean, one of the reasons I think maybe why we were able to get so many responses to our survey is, and I don't remember now, maybe Chelsea or Edmund remember how many different listservs we sent that to. We didn't just use the Delta Stewardship Council listserv. We asked our partner agencies and collaborative group hosts to distribute that survey as well. So it does take this additional work to get the outreach done.
Thank you very much for all your efforts. Really appreciate it.
Diane?
Yeah, I had a comment or a question. One of the topics we'll be considering is HABs. And when we did our workshop, if I remember correctly, there was over 70 people who signed up for that workshop. And we don't know, or I don't know, whether they're in the policymakers or the stakeholder group, or how those individuals would align themselves with the different categories of participants or interested parties you identified. And it would have been great to kind of capture that if we had a little questionnaire, who are you, or something like that. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I feel like I need to defer to the social scientists here. But that is something that in the science program, because we put on a lot of events too, and we're learning that, as you just said, there are opportunities, especially with the pandemic and more virtual signups, that it is an opportunity to collect that additional information. And so that my personal opinion is that's a really good idea, to collect it then. And to figure out how to do it.
Can I add a little bit more?
Just ask them, how did they even find out to come to that workshop? How did they find out about it? I mean, often, you know, when you go someplace, that will be a question that people ask you. How did you know about this?
Yes. Go ahead, Edmund.
Yeah, I think for right now for our meetings and our seminars for the Delta ISB, we actually do require registration. And as part of registration, we do ask them questions. We don't ask them, how did you hear about the meeting? That's something that we could potentially change as well, so you get some additional information.
Yeah.
But we are requiring, they do fill out a registration form beforehand, and we can definitely add to those fields.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we asked that question in our, was that in the survey, Chelsea? We asked how you hear about the ISB meetings?
Yeah, and the top category actually was the Delta Stewardship Council listserv. But people also did select multiple categories. That was just the one that received the most check boxes.
Okay, so Lauren, your public comments are due December 1st, and then I don't want to pin you down, but when exactly will the final report be done?
Well, we're hoping as soon as possible thereafter. It really depends on the extent of the comments.
Okay.
So we'll play it by ear once we get all the comments in.
Okay, well, I also want to echo what everyone else is saying is thank you and Chelsea and Edmund for this report. This is really valuable for us, and it will be valuable for us in many ways. So I think we're always trying to improve what we do and how we do it and who it serves. So I think this will really be of help to us. So thanks for taking this on.
Great.
And for
Thank
those of you who haven't heard, in November, Lauren will actually be joining the support team for the board as the Delta Science Program's lead program manager for ISB support. And for the new board members, Lauren has worked with us before, and so I welcome her back. And this will be a great addition to our team. So welcome aboard.
Great. Thanks, Steve.
Any public comments on this topic?
We have one from Deirdre.
Okay.
Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute.
Thank you. Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. And I do think the response on the water supply reliability review was influenced by, I did work full-time on an outreach and social media campaign for raising awareness of the Independent Science Board's plight for 7 months. And so there were regular blog posts about the Independent Science Board, regular outreach on social media, particularly on Twitter, which has a very broad cross-section. There's California Water Twitter, and there's a broad cross-section of stakeholders that are there. Maven's Notebook would carry all of my blog posts on the Delta Independent Science Board, and they get a very broad readership as well. And then also I worked with a huge cross-section of environmental, fishing, and Delta stakeholders over the decade work I've done, because I have a background in organizing as well as in research. And so, I was doing outreach to them about the importance of the Delta Independent Science Board, what the Delta Independent Science Board does. No, they're not actually funded by DWR. Yes, what they do is really important. And so I think that's the kind of thing that really raised awareness. And I do think when I saw the comments coming in, I thought, that this is good. But I really think the Delta Stewardship Council, the Delta Science Program, has a really good social media outreach. And I think just, some more pooling of resources would be helpful. The other thing I wanted to say was as far as agencies, I did speak about this at the Delta Stewardship Council meeting. There's a framework of power in California Water, and it's based on a list by Hisham Zuaddin, who's at the University of Cambridge. And it's a framework of power determines who determines the frames of reference, who has moral authority, who is entitled to respect and deference, and whose intentionality matters, and also who has priority of access to resources. And you folks just spent the last year, the Independent Science Board was on the other side, was on the side of the people I work for. And I donate my work as a scientist for them because they don't have priority of access to resources. They don't get funding. They don't have a good knowledge of science, and I, help them with reading very technical documents and analyzing the use of science and so on. But I would ask you, as you look at your own outreach, to really try to be conscious of, the agencies are determining frameworks, and the frameworks are in many ways very adverse to fishing stakeholders, very adverse to environmental stakeholders, very adverse to Delta stakeholders. And the public processes are important because, sometimes the actions that, in the view of my clients, would be best for fish are prematurely said, well, there's no way we could do that, or we need to delay, or we need to study more. And we are in a crisis. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks again for those comments. Any other public comments, Edmund?
There are none.
And none for the next item, which is public comments for items not on the agenda?
We do have one for that one. Deirdre also has a comment on that agenda item. And Deirdre, you can unmute your microphone.
I think I said everything I had to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, we're going to adjourn. I remind folks to participate in their briefing sessions starting at 1 o'clock. And the full board will reconvene tomorrow at 9:30, and we're going to consider the water supply reliability and the monitoring reviews, and then spend a large open discussion on talking about future reviews for the board. So we'll see you all back tomorrow at 9:30. And oh wait, Tom's got a point.
Steve, I think I misplaced my instructions for the briefing sessions.
Okay, Edmund, can you take care of that?
Yes.
I think he said yes.
Yes, sorry.
You'll find out.
Yeah, you'll find out. Okay, well, thanks everyone, and we'll officially adjourn and see you tomorrow at 9:30.